Hello everyone, tonight we will cross an almost forgotten portal, a place where time does not run, it whispers, and where, behind cold walls, the world of medieval nuns unfolded in silence, discipline, and solitude. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a convent shrouded in mist, ancient stones breathing moisture. Inside, a young girl, so young, steps uncertainly. Perhaps she wanted to be somewhere else. Perhaps she had no choice. But what if you could walk with her? Hear the echo of the bells that rule the days. Feel the invisible weight of a vow that changes destiny. What if, at the end of this story, you discovered that the peace of the cloisters hid pains that few dare to tell? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And if you want, write in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I like to imagine this thread of history crossing so many cities, so many nights. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or an aroma diffuser to help you along the way. And let's get started together. The door creaks softly and closes behind you. The air is thick, cold. The walls, bare stone, exude a dampness that penetrates the rough, newly put on habit. The small room that awaits you holds a narrow bed, a bench, a candle that dances silently. There are no paintings. There is no voice. Only the sound of your own breathing. Every step in the hallway echoes like a secret. The other young women, also newcomers, retreat to their own corners, and when the candle goes out, all that remains is darkness, and a cold that seems to come from within. You try to sleep, but there, sleep is a discipline that is learned. Little by little, the first few days bring no answer, only questions that no one dares to ask out loud. When the morning light shines through the narrow window, you already know. Time here is not yours. Time belongs to the bell, to the rule, to the ritual, and it all started long before you walked through those gates. Some people think that the young women who came here did so out of vocation. Some, perhaps. But for many others, like you, the story was different. Decided in family conversations, in silent agreement. No choice. No way back. You remember well the room where your father said the words. It wasn't a question. It was a fate announced. And here you are, with a name that already sounds strange, with clothes you didn't choose, with a future already mapped out by other people's hands. The vow of obedience seems simple on paper, but in the flesh, in the spirit, it weighs on the body that must bow, on the voice that must be silenced, on the desires that must be stifled before they are even born. When other nuns pass you in the hallways, their gaze is lowered. It is not known whether out of respect or fear. Deep friendships are not well regarded, because a nun should belong to the divine, and not to the affection of the flesh. So you learn to be silent. You learn to wait for the bell to ring that will tell you what to do, and when to do it. You learn that the most dangerous desire is to be free, because here, freedom is a word that fades into an echo. As the day drags on in prayers and work, your mind wanders. Sometimes you imagine a life outside, but you soon correct yourself, because even your thoughts are watched. And the vow, invisible, is always there, a thread that holds you back, a weight that you cannot see, but you feel it with every breath you take. Not all women arrived at a convent with faith in their hearts or a vocation in their eyes. To understand this story, we need to go back in time a little. Imagine a world where being a woman almost always meant being part of a social transaction. Daughter, wife, widow. These were the most common trajectories. In many families, especially those of nobles or prosperous merchants, marriage was a political currency. Sons were potential alliances, daughters, pieces on the chessboard. But what about when the family had many daughters? When dowries were too expensive, or when an advantageous marriage was not possible? For many of these girls, the convent was not a divine calling. It was an imposed destiny. In the records of the time, there are many reports of girls being sent to monasteries when they were still children. Some were 7 or 8 years old. Others were a little older. The more fortunate ones could be educated there. They could learn to read, sing, embroider. But above all, they could learn to obey. There was an economic logic to this custom. Keeping a daughter in a convent was cheaper than paying for a wedding. And for smaller families, having a nun among their relatives was a source of pride, a sign of devotion, a living offering to the church. That was how it was thought. And there were other, even darker reasons. In times of crisis, war or plague, families saw the convents as a refuge, a way to ensure that their daughters would have a roof over their heads, food and protection, even if the price was freedom. At other times, girls who were considered difficult, rebellious, or even those who did not fit the expectations of marriage were sent to the cloister. There, their spirit would be tamed, Their individuality would be dissolved in the collective of monastic rules. Within the walls of the convent, however, life was not simple. The ideal of the pious nun was a construct. The reality was often much harsher. Imagine a young woman, deprived of the outside world, with strict rules about how to behave, when to speak, what to think. The vow of obedience was not just a symbolic ritual. It was a contract of submission, a commitment to annul oneself for the sake of the institution and faith. It was a constant learning process, stifling desires, erasing personal dreams, accepting a path that one had not chosen. The days were organized around prayer and work, but silence was a constant presence, and social control was relentless. The superiors monitored not only behavior, but also thoughts. Small slips, such as a prolonged look or an inappropriate word, could be interpreted as signs of spiritual weakness, and punishments ranged from extra prayers to long periods of isolation. Life in the convent was a rigid choreography. Every step, every gesture, every sigh was guided by rules that spread like invisible roots. It is important to remember that not all nuns were there against their will. There were women who, yes, sought a life of spiritual retreat, but they were a minority. For most, the convent represented the end of a world they had barely known. Dreams of love, freedom, or even simple choices were left behind. The habit became an armor and a prison, obedience, a second skin. And over time, many learned to silence not only their voices, but also their hearts. At its core, the vow of obedience was a silent pact, an agreement with a system that saw them more as symbols than as people. Their given name was often replaced by a religious one. It was a symbolic death of their former selves, every birth shaped by the expectations of others. And so, between murmured prayers and lowered eyes, these women went about their days, not by choice, but because in the Middle Ages, being a woman almost never meant choosing. You wake up to the sound of the bell. Your body still asks for a moment of rest, but the habits here are not made for comfort. You get up, adjusting your veil with trembling fingers. The morning cold is biting and your stomach empty. But that's a good thing, they say. After all, who needs bread when you have faith? If only it were that simple. In practice, fasting was one of the most refined arts of the convent. Not eating was, in theory, an act of devotion, of purification, of spiritual elevation. In reality, it was a surefire recipe for dizziness, weakness, and unedifying thoughts about any crumb that crossed your field of vision. And between you and me, few things distract the soul more than the image of a piece of well-cured cheese, when all you have is a thin soup that looks more like a sermon in liquid form. Fasts were frequent and long. During Lent, for example, the meals allowed were so frugal that even a picky mouse would have refused the menu. No meat, no fat, much less small pleasures like eggs or milk. And since the liturgical calendar was full of days of fasting and abstinence, the feeling of deprivation became a more faithful companion than any sister in the convent. During the long hours of prayer, the body protested. The stomach growled in unison with the chants. It was a peculiar concert, and there was an almost cruel detail. The sense of smell did not fast. The smell of the fat candles, of the bread that the kitchen prepared for the superiors or for special occasions, floated through the corridors like a malicious reminder, living proof that earthly suffering was still very present. Interestingly, the ecclesiastical authorities justified everything with great eloquence. The suffering of the body strengthened the spirit. The temptations of the flesh were overcome with each spoonful of bland broth. But let's face it, after days like this, even a crumb seemed like a banquet fit for kings. And ironically, thoughts increasingly revolved around food. A delicious paradox. The longer one fasted, the more one's mind became a walking menu. Still, the nuns continued, not out of pleasure, but out of obligation. To complain would be a lack of humility. To give in a sin. And so, between one psalm and another, they learned the art of disguising their hungry gaze, to carry their staggering bodies with a serene smile, and, of course, to never, ever confess that all they really wanted at that moment was a slice of bread with butter. In the end, fasting may have had a spiritual effect, but not the one we imagined. Above all, it taught patience, tolerance, and a deep understanding that, at certain moments in life, a simple bowl of hot soup is the most sublime of miracles. Have you ever stopped to think about what it would be like to live in a place where the smell never changes? And I don't mean floral perfumes or freshly baked bread. No, they are here, within these stone walls, carries a scent that is, let's just say, unforgettable. A carefully cultivated mix of humidity, candle grease, and fabrics that have become almost relics over the years. As soon as you wake up, your first breath brings with it this peculiar aroma. The tallow candles burn slowly, releasing a thick smoke that permeates everything. The habit you wear every day has absorbed so many layers of this smell that it seems to have developed a personality of its own. And the walls. Oh, the walls. They breathe humidity. Years of condensation and discrete fungi that paint delicate watercolors in shades of grayish green in the corners. Now imagine this. Clothes that are washed infrequently because hot water is a luxury and soap is an article of faith. The fabrics become heavy, rough, and never dry completely. So every fold of linen holds moisture like an ancient secret. Putting on the robe in the morning is like wrapping yourself in a cold, slightly clammy embrace. A daily ritual that demands more resignation than any prayer. In the narrow corridors, the situation does not improve. The human warmth, combined with the candles always lit and the almost non-existent air circulation, creates a dense, almost palpable atmosphere. And when the bell calls for collective prayers, the chapel transforms into a veritable cauldron of mixed smells. Incense and candle grease try to mask what cannot be hidden. The effort is noble, but in vain. During the long hours of prayer, the sense of smell finds no rest. Each breath brings uninvited memories of the damp fabric, the cold walls, the wooden benches that creak under the weight of time and people. And if by chance you dare to dream of fresh air, well, let it remain a dream. The windows are few, small, more intended to keep the soul enclosed than to renew the air. Now, mind you, this isn't negligent. It was what could be done with the resources of the time. But let's face it, if someone said that convents were environments of purity, they weren't talking about the air. It took a strong faith to transcend these olfactory details and find true inner peace. And so, day after day, you learn to accept this scent of moist eternity. With each breath, a lesson in humility, and who knows, an extra incentive to aspire not only to heavenly virtue, but also, who knows, one day to a fresh, clean breeze. Within those stone walls, as cold as the vows you had made, one thing was certain. Time no longer belonged to you. It belonged to the bells. Yes, the bells. Those bronze instruments that seemed to take particular pleasure in interrupting any attempt at serene contemplation or furtive nap. Life in the convent was an eternal rhythm dictated by the bell. You woke up to the sound of the bell. You prayed to the sound of the bell. You ate, or rather, you fasted to the sound of the bell. And of course, the bell also marked when you could finally try to sleep. It was almost an invisible conductor, conducting the monotonous symphony of monastic existence. During the day, the sound reverberated of the stone walls like an irresistible call. The echoes travelled down the narrow corridors, invaded the rooms, and penetrated the souls. There was nowhere to run. Even in moments of retreat, you could count on it to remind you that, no, you were not in control of anything at all. But the bells were not alone in this peculiar soundscape. There was also the singing. Female voices woven into Gregorian chants, their soft echoes filling the chapel. Beautiful. Yes, but after the 10th morning repetition, it began to sound more like a hypnotic mantra that sent the mind wandering far away. Far away. Perhaps even to the village bakery, where the smell of freshly baked bread was just a forbidden memory. The footsteps also spoke. Each wooden sandal that crossed the corridors left a dry, rhythmic sound, like a metronome of resignation. The nuns walked slowly, in a line, like shadows dressed in rough cloth. The almost total absence of conversation made each sound more audible, more present. The slight creaking of the wood, the whisper of habits, even the muffled sound of breathing. Everything became part of a soundtrack where silence was not empty, but a constant character. At night, when darkness fell over the cloisters, the soundscape changed. The bell, more spaced out, rang with an almost poetic melancholy. The night songs became softer, almost like a lullaby for weary souls. And ironically, in these moments, the sounds that once imprisoned you could offer a rare solace, like a reminder that, despite everything, you were not alone in this eternal vigil. Thus, amidst the echoes of bronze, ritualized chants and footsteps that seemed like stories whispered to the ground, the days and nights unfolded. And you learned with each chime that in the convent, time was a demanding master, but also, in its own peculiar way, a constant companion, even if a little insistent. Among the many silent rituals of the convent, there was one that carried special weight. It was not talked about much. It was not a topic of conversation in the refectory. It was not sung in the psalms. But each one knew, deep down, what it meant. The tonsure, the ritual of shaving one's head, a gesture of surrender, or of erasure. It depends on your point of view. The first time you see a shaved head, it's a shock. Not so much because of the sight itself, but because of what it represents. Hair loss back then was more than just an aesthetic issue. It was a symbolic loss of identity, a literal cutting off of any remaining vanity. And if today, hair can be seen as an adornment, back then it was one of the main markers of femininity and beauty. Imagine the impact in a world where marriage, social status, and even a woman's perceived worth were all based in part on her appearance. Having your head shaved was a clear signal. You no longer belong in this game. You are no longer a potential bride. You belong to another realm now. A realm of stone, discipline, and heavy veils. Of course, the nuns did not parade around with their heads bare. The tonsure, in many orders, was hidden under thick veils and multiple layers of fabric. But they knew, and that was enough. There was a kind of silent complicity between them, a mutual recognition that they all carried, beneath that dark fabric, the same gesture of renunciation. Interestingly, while superiors spoke of the tonsure as a symbol of purity and humility, many nuns experienced it as a small personal mourning. It was not uncommon to see discreet tears the first time scissors were used to cut their hair, a farewell not only to their hair, but to a past that was becoming increasingly distant, to a version of themselves that no longer existed. And the touch, the touch of her shaved head was a constant reminder. Beneath the veil, her scalp felt the winter chill with brutal sincerity. Every breeze became an icy whisper. There was no way to forget. It was an invisible mark, but as real as the vow spoken before the altar. Over time, you learned to live with it. The tonsure stopped being an open wound and became part of the new you. But deep down, in a hidden corner of your mind, there always lingered a silent question. Who was I before the blade touched my skin? And there, amidst veils and silences, that question echoed, unanswered. Solidarity. A beautiful word, isn't it? But within a medieval convent, it had its very well-defined limitations. It was allowed to pray in a group, sing in unison, work side by side, but creating deep bonds. Oh, that was another story. Very close friendships were viewed with suspicion. Because a nun should love God above all else, not her companions. After all, just imagine if human affection began to compete with the divine. It would be a scandal of celestial proportions. In everyday life, this surveillance was subtle but constant. Prolonged glances between sisters, noted, complicit smiles during hymns, observed, long whispered conversations in less frequented corners. Well, best avoided. There was always one sister who was more zealous, the one who seemed to have a sixth sense for detecting dangerously warm emotional bonds, and she did not hesitate to report everything to the Mother Superior. The result was an environment where loneliness was, paradoxically, shared. Everyone there felt it, but no one spoke. Each nun carried her own longings, doubts, and anxieties, and, ironically, she saw in the others a reflection of herself. But she couldn't get too close. It was a silent game of calculated distance, like dancing in a mind ballroom. One false step and there would be penance. But where there is repression, there is also fertile ground for petty intrigues. When affection is forbidden, tension builds, and so veiled rivalries are born. Small disputes for recognition from the Mother Superior, for lighter tasks, for a look of approval. It was not uncommon for subtle gestures, a cold look, a cutting word during work to say much more than the vows of humility proclaimed in public. Jealousy? Oh, it was always there. If one sister was praised for her impeccable embroidery, the others would soon look at her with a mixture of admiration and barely concealed resentment. If someone managed to get a rare moment of conversation with a more experienced nun, there would be sidelong glances, as if a diplomatic treaty were being signed right there, between the veils. Of course, there were also sincere attempts at friendship, but these had to be carefully disguised. A gesture of support here, a hidden note there, a lingering touch of the hand during work. Small crumbs of affection thrown into the abyss of emotional isolation. Because, deep down, everyone knew, no matter how much spiritual communion was preached, living surrounded by silence and rules without a single true bond. That, yes, was a challenge to faith. And so, each sister learned to walk alone among the others, to maintain a serene facade while her heart yearned for a friendly word, a look of understanding. Loneliness was a habit no less heavy than the veil they wore. And perhaps of all the vows, the hardest to fulfill was precisely this one, not to love to, at least, not someone you could touch. If you think life in the convent was all about prayers and fasting, well, there were also needles. Lots of needles. And thread, miles of thread. Embroidery was almost a second liturgy, a daily ritual that went on for hours on end, often until the sun was no longer shining and they had to sew by the flickering light of candles. The justification was noble, of course. Embroidery decorated the vestments of the church, the altars, and the vestments of the clergy themselves. They were offerings of beauty to divine glory. But let's face it, after embroidering the 100th bouquet of stylized lilies or the 1000th small Easter lamb, the enthusiasm tended to evaporate along with the candle wax. The nuns' hands were their main working tool, and they were also the first to suffer. Imagine holding a needle for hours, with dry fingers, your skin constantly scratched by the rough linen or treacherous. It was not uncommon for small wounds to open up. Bandaged fingers became almost a badge of honor among the sisters. After all, bleeding for embroidery was, in a way, a pious sacrifice. But there was one detail that few outsiders understood. While the hands moved almost automatically, the mind was free. And there, in the back and forth of the needle, many stories took shape, not only in the fabric, but in the thoughts of the women who embroidered. It was their moment of mental escape, of sewing with invisible threads, memories, desires, even little secret stories that would never be said out loud. In a corner of the workroom, the sound of needles piercing fabric created a hypnotic rhythm, almost a medieval ASMR, if you will. Each prick, a heartbeat trying to stay present. Each stitch, a step on an inner path where it was possible, for a moment, to escape the convent walls. Of course, officially embroidery was an exercise in discipline and devotion, but in practice, it was also a way for humanity to escape, still resisting beneath the layers of rules and veils. It was through embroidery that stories were told without words, that people daydreamed, and that they wove, with colored threads, a little of the life that habit tried to erase. And so, day after day, needle after needle, the nuns transformed fabric and blood into art. Embroidery that spanned the centuries, but also scars that remained only on the skin and in memory. And perhaps deep down, in each stitch, there was a small whisper not of praise, but of resistance. Among all the invisible luxuries of the convent, there was one that shone like gold to the few who could reach it. Books. Not the ones for daily prayers, in which everyone participated. I am talking about the books kept under lock and key in the library. That cold room, scented with ancient dust and aged wood, where knowledge lay, untouched by most. In the Middle Ages, books were treasures, hand-copied, illustrated with almost sacred detail. They were as rare as they were desired, and they were not available to just anyone. No, access was a carefully guarded privilege. Only the most literate nuns or those assigned to copying and maintenance work were allowed to cross the threshold of the library and dive into that silent sea of words. Imagine yourself then, as a young nun who had just arrived, thirsty for knowledge, eyes eager for stories that went beyond the Psalms. Passing by the library door was a daily torment. Inside, hidden under thick leather covers, were entire worlds, stories of distant lands, forbidden philosophy, knowledge that would never be read aloud in the choir. The irony? Many of the sisters could read the Latin hymns, but were discouraged from reading anything else, because knowing too much was a risk. After all, a restless mind might question. And questioning was not exactly the most recommended behavior in an environment where obedience was the supreme virtue. So, all that was left was to observe from afar, to imagine, and sometimes, if luck or the kindness of a more experienced nun allowed it, perhaps to peek at an open page, to hear a passage read in a low voice. It was a silent intellectual smuggling, small crumbs of knowledge that fed the most curious souls in a world of high walls and monitored thoughts. But for most, the books remained as untouchable relics. And so, while hands embroidered and lips recited prayers, the mind wove unanswered questions. What lay beyond the walls? What did those forbidden texts say? It was a kind of hunger that not even the most severe fasting could quell. And perhaps for this very reason, some nuns never lost hope. Because where there is a closed bookshelf, there is always a curious soul dreaming of opening it. Even if, in this case, the price of a forbidden reading was much higher than a few nights of penance. Sleeping in the convent was almost a prize. Something granted in small doses, never guaranteed. Not because the bed was comfortable, not because the silence of the night was absolute, but because guilt had a nasty habit of waking the nuns when they least expected it. Nighttime penance was one of those silent and, let's say, little publicized rituals. While during the day everything was prayers and work, at night certain more zealous or more restless souls sought to atone for their sins while most were asleep. And how did they atone? Well, with not so subtle methods. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, summoned by a conscience that, so trained, already knew the right time to interfere with your rest. Kneeling on the cold floor of the chapel, surrounded by shadows, muttering endless prayers while your exhausted body begged for a break. But for some, that wasn't enough. There were also practices of self-flagellation. Yes, you read that right. Small leather disciplines with knots or spikes were used by those who wanted, or were instructed to, mortify the flesh. After all, it was said that where there is pain, there is purification. A philosophy that, let's face it, didn't exactly favor a restful sleep. And don't think that these penances were reserved only for great sins. An impure thought, a gesture of vanity, a prolonged look, any mistake could be grounds for a session of self-inflicted suffering. And since guilt was an inexhaustible resource within the convent walls, the knights always had some restless presences wandering the corridor in search of spiritual relief. The strangest thing was that, for many nuns, this routine became almost a habit, not because they loved the pain, but because the entire system made them believe that they would never be pure enough. It was a perverse cycle, that the more they sought perfection, the more their flaws stood out. And so, the early morning, which could have been a rare moment of peace, became yet another battlefield, fought against themselves. At dawn, with heavy eyes and an aching body, it was time to put on the habit and carry on with the day as if nothing had happened. And there was the true miracle, smiling serenely after a night of penance. Because, after all, a good nun does not complain. She simply offers everything, including her sleep. In the name of faith, there was one detail that the convent rules could not overcome. No matter how hard they tried, the cycle of the season. Inside, the routine was always the same. Prayers, work, silence, penance. But outside, the world was changing, and each change was felt with an intensity that bordered on suffering. The convent windows, narrow as the slits of a fortress, let in only fragments of light. A grey winter sky, a vibrant summer blue, a golden yellow in the fall, a lush green in the spring. And oh, how each of these views was desired. Because to see the world, even through a crack, was to remember that it kept turning, even when the nun's life seemed suspended in time. Imagine spending months among cold stones and dark corridors with the smell of burning candles and damp fabrics for company. And suddenly, a ray of sunlight shines through the window. A smell of wet earth arrives on the breeze. A breath of warm air touches your face. At such times, even the most devout nun could feel her heart tighten. Not out of ingratitude for religious life, but because, deep down, there was still a simple and human desire to feel the world. Spring was especially cruel. The flowers bloomed outside, the birds sang, and inside, the prayers continued, the hands continued to sew, the songs continued to sound. But the gaze was inevitably lost in the direction of the window. It was a kind of poetic torture, knowing that beauty was there, so close, and yet so inaccessible. Summer brought a different dilemma. The heat made habits even heavier, the rooms even more stuffy, and seeing the sunshine outside, without being able to feel it on your skin, was a constant invitation to nostalgia for a freedom that perhaps had never really been yours. The world was a book that you could only peek at from the spine. In autumn, the falling leaves were a reminder that everything passes, even the most unforgiving weather inside the convent. But it was a bittersweet consolation, because watching the leaves dance in the wind while one remained still, sewing or kneeling, taught a bitter lesson about patience, or, as some said in their minds, about forced resignation. And winter, oh, winter, the season most honest to life in the convent. Cold inside, cold outside, little light, little colour. It was almost as if the world outside shared the same spirit that dominated the stone corridors. And yet, even in winter, there was a longing, because even the smallest ray of sunshine on a frosty morning had a taste of freedom. So, year after year, the seasons passed, and each one left its mark on the nuns' souls. They could not touch them, they could not live them fully, but they felt them like someone watching a river from afar, wishing, perhaps secretly, that one day they could dive in. In a medieval convent, where speaking was already a carefully measured concession, the worst punishment someone could receive was to lose that right completely. Yes, the silence that to the outside world might sound like a blessing, inside could turn into the most feared of punishment. The mistakes that led to this punishment, almost any, a look considered inappropriate, a smile at an inappropriate moment, a light comment during homework, a forgetfulness during a prayer. In short, any deviation, no matter how human, could be interpreted as a lack of humility, spiritual distraction, or even rebellion. And the institutional response, silence, immediate and absolute. When the Mother Superior pronounced the words imposing the punishment, an invisible weight fell on the nun's shoulders. For days, sometimes weeks, she could not speak to anyone, and more importantly, no one could speak to her. It was a subtle and very effective form of social isolation. After all, even among women forced into seclusion, the small consolation of human interaction had its value. The cruelest thing about this practice was its insidious nature. The punished nun continued to participate in the activity, sat with the others in the refectory, and sewed alongside her companion. But there, in that shared space, she became a spectre, invisible in conversations, absent from gazes. The world around her continued as if she did not exist, a constant reminder that her presence was tolerated but not desired. And of course, there was a whole theatre around it. The sisters were instructed not to show excessive compassion, a gesture of consolation, look that was too sympathetic. And that was it. Another one could join the circle of silence. It was a system that fed mutual surveillance, and that made each one remember, day after day, the price of a small mistake. The greatest irony was that, in an environment where so little was spoken, the little that remained became precious, and when that right was taken away, the weight was immense. It wasn't the silence itself that hurt, but the awareness that it had been imposed. That, for a perhaps trivial mistake, you had become an uncomfortable present, a living reminder of human imperfections in a world that pretended to seek perfection. Over time, many nuns learned to control every gesture, every word, every look, not out of spiritual conviction, but out of pure instinct for emotional survival. Because in a place where silence was a weapon, speaking even carefully became an act of courage. If there was something that softened, even if only for a moment, the rigidity of life in the convent, it was the songs. Those moments when the nuns' voices rose, filling the stone walls with almost ethereal sound. Curious, isn't it? The same space that so often seemed like a cold prison, for a few hours transformed into a temple of soft echoes, where beauty managed to infiltrate, even through the narrowest crack. The nights were long, the body was tired, the mind restless. Sleep, that silent traitor, did not always come when it was needed most. And that was when the nightly chants became, for many nuns, an almost therapeutic ritual. It was not just prayer. It was a lull, a kind of auditory consolation in a world where touch and words of affection were scarce. Imagine the scene. The evening bell tolled, calling for the last prayer of the day. The nuns, wrapped in their heavy habits, walked slowly toward the chapel. The candles cast dancing shadows on the walls. The air carried the scent of incense, mixed with the somewhat less poetic smell of cold stones. And then the first chords echoed. Gregorian chant, with its slow, repetitive cadence, had an almost hypnotic effect. It was not uncommon for people's eyes to grow heavy in the middle of a psalm, their heads to fall forward a little. It was not said out loud, but many of them would surrender to brief moments of near sleep, lulled by the melody they were singing. If there was such a thing as medieval ASMR, this was it. The most interesting thing was that, in addition to the liturgy, the songs created a rare sense of emotional communion. There, all the voices merged. It didn't matter if there were rivalries or hidden tensions during the day. At that moment, they were a single mass of sound. And perhaps precisely for that reason, the moment was so precious. It was a space where the rigidity of the rules gave way, albeit subtly, to something more human. And of course, there were the more pragmatic sisters, who saw the nighttime chants as an excellent opportunity to begin the transition. The predictable cadence, the repetition of the words, everything helped. It was almost an invitation to let the mind float away, for the thoughts to dissolve in the rhythm of the music and the body to finally surrender to rest. So, night after night, the songs became an anchor, not a complete salvation, but a breath of fresh air, a reminder that even in the most controlled life, there was still room for beauty. And that, for a few precious verses, sound could be a shelter where silence so often felt like punishment. Dressing for the day in the convent was not a matter of fashion. Far from it. Each layer of fabric was a tangible reminder of the role the nun played. And more than that, it was a veritable armor. Not against swords or arrows, but against the touch of the world, and in many cases, against the touch of herself. The complete habit did not leave much room for individuality. It began with a thick tunic, usually made of wool or linen, as heavy as the responsibilities it carried. Then came the scapula, the veil, the coif, a veritable arsenal of garments whose main purpose was to hide, not just the body, but any trace that might remind one that, beneath all that fabric, there was a woman. With skin, curves, and get this, humanity. The touch of the world, even the most innocent, like the sun on your skin or the wind in your hair, was seen as potentially dangerous. After all, any physical pleasure, no matter how simple, could be an invitation to temptation. Better then, to cover everything up, If the world didn't touch you, you wouldn't be touched by the world either. Impeccable logic, at least on paper. But of course, this protection came at a price. The summer heat turned the habit into a walking furnace. The winter humidity turned it into a cold, heavy cocoon. The clothes chafed the skin, created chafing, and made every movement a physical reminder of the vow of renunciation. And yet, the nun was expected to wear them with humility and joy. Because nothing says devout life like a serene smile hiding constant discomfort. The veil, in particular, had a profound symbolism. It hid the hair, yes, but it also hid, in a way, the identity itself. Each nun, an indistinct silhouette, a face framed by the same dark fabric. It was a subtle way of erasing individuality, of ensuring that vanity, that ever-lurking enemy, did not find fertile ground. And there was a curious detail. Although the fabric armor served to keep the world away, it also created a kind of emotional armor. Over time, the nuns learned to take refuge under the layers of clothing. They became less visible, less vulnerable, and paradoxically, freer to live their interiority. Because if no one could see who you were on the outside, at least what was on the inside remained yours alone. So, every morning, when she got dressed, the nun did not just put on a habit. She put on a mask, a protection against a world she had learned to fear and avoid. And if, at times, she missed the touch of the sun, the freshness of the breeze, well, it was just another small sacrifice. Because, as they said between suppressed sighs, holiness was never synonymous with comfort. Anyone looking at a medieval convent from the outside could easily be deceived. The imposing walls, the soft chants, the nuns standing in a row with serene expression. Everything seemed in perfect harmony. A true oasis of spiritual peace, at least in theory. Because on the inside, the reality was much more human. Living in such a restricted environment, with rigid rules and limited freedom, caused small tensions to build up like steam in a closed pot. And like every pot, from time to time, the pressure needed to find an outlet. That's when small conflicts arose. No open wars, of course. The game was much more subtle. It was a true championship of veiled rivalry. There was the most devout nun, who made a point of always singing a little louder during Mass, as if proximity to the divine could be measured in decibels. There was the exemplary embroidery sister, who left her work strategically visible, so that everyone could admire her talent, and notice the almost theatrical modesty with which she displayed it. And, of course, there were those who vied for the attention and favor of the Mother Superior, like invisible courtesans in a medieval court game. The intrigues developed in the details. A cold look during a meal, an accidental forgetting to include a sister's name in the community prayers, a whispered comment about someone's posture during prayer, small blows delivered with velvet gloves, because attacking head-on would be a sin, but a well-calibrated touch of hypocrisy. That went unnoticed. The most heated disputes usually revolved around tasks. Who would have the honor or the curse of tending the altar? Who would get an extra moment in the library? Who would receive the difficult mission of escorting an illustrious visitor? Every opportunity was a status currency, and even beneath veils and habits, human vanity always found a way to infiltrate. And the most fascinating thing was that all these little wars were fought under a veneer of sanctity. No one admitted resentment. No one spoke openly of their frustrations. It was a continuous theater, where silence served both for contemplation and to hide true feelings. Thus, the cloister that at first glance seemed like a haven of peace was in fact an emotional chessboard, a space where perfection was an unattainable ideal, and where, behind every serene gesture, there could be a strategically positioned, because, in the end, even the vow of humility did not cancel out the fact that, before being saints, they were human. And that, my friends, not even the habit could hide. When you think of a medieval convent, you might imagine a space of absolute silence. And yes, silence was an essential part of life there, but there was a sound that pierced even the darkest of nights. The bell, always the bell, like an invisible master conducting the orchestra of time. The convent bell didn't just serve to mark the hours. It was an instrument of control, a reminder that time was no longer hers. It belonged to the rule, to the routine, to the rhythm imposed by the church. Each chime cut through the cold night air and pierced the stone walls, reaching every room. No nun was immune to its call. The early morning had its own ritual. In the midst of a light and fragmented sleep, you could be awakened by that deep and insistent sound. It was the warning for night prayers. The body, still heavy, needed to move. The wooden sandals met the cold floor. The dark corridors came alive with footsteps echoing in unison. And there they were, reunited again, while the rest of the world slept. The bell marked much more than moments of prayer. It was the compass of life in the convent. It announced the time to wake up, to eat, to work, to meditate, to sleep, or to try to sleep when insomnia was no longer strong. It was a kind of sonorous guardian, always attentive, always present, and over time, the mind began to anticipate its tolling, a curious form of medieval conditioning. But the dawn bell had a particular effect. Its lingering echo mingled with one's deepest thoughts. In that threshold between dreaming and waking, its chimes created an almost hypnotic soundtrack. Some nuns said it was a sound that penetrated the soul. Others, more pragmatic, thought it was merely an annoying reminder that their rest would be shorter than they had hoped. Interestingly, over the years, many developed an almost affectionate relationship with that sound, not because they loved it, but because it became a constant presence, a thread that wove together their days and nights. In a world where everything was predictable and controlled, the bell was the collective heartbeat of the convent. So, every morning, when the echo of the bells spread through the sleeping cloister, the nuns would get up, not just out of obedience, but because they knew that there was something more in that ringing, a reminder that, inside there, time did not belong to them. But, ironically, it was precisely this imposed time that structured their existence. Within the convent walls, there was a space that, although not officially listed in the rulebooks, was perhaps the most disputed and silently loved. The garden, a small square of land surrounded by stone corridors, where the outside world could finally breathe a little inside the cloister. Officially, the garden was a space for growing medicinal herbs and flowers for the altar. But for the nuns, it was much more than that. It was a sensory portal, a reminder that the world was not made only of stone and silence. And perhaps, for that very reason, its importance was inversely proportional to its size. As they crossed the small archway that led to the garden, their senses were awakened. The smell of damp earth, the scent of flowers, the discreet buzzing of insects. Simple elements that, in such a controlled daily life, seemed almost magical. The nuns looked around with reverent delicacy, as if each leaf were a small miracle that had been permitted. And of course, the touch of the earth. Oh, the touch of the earth. For those who spent their days wrapped in layers of fabric, embroidering or kneeling, feeling the cold, living texture of the soil between their fingers was an almost subversive gesture, a small act of resistance against the aridity of everyday life. Often, some would unnecessarily prolong the care of the herbs, taking advantage of every second of connection with something that was not imposed, but simply natural. Colors also played a crucial role. In an environment where black, grey, and beige predominated, seeing the vibrant red of a flower, the deep green of a leaf, or the soft blue of a cloudless sky was a visual balm. There were sisters who even mentally memorized the cycle of the flowers in the garden, as if it were a secret calendar that marked real time, not that imposed by the bells. But like everything else in the convent, access to the garden had its rules. You couldn't just wander around whenever you wanted. You had to have a reason, a task, permission, and that made every moment there all the more precious. It wasn't just a physical space, it was an emotional refuge, a reminder that even beneath the weight of habits and vows, there was still beauty, life, and a glimmer of freedom. Thus, the small garden became a silent confidant. There, among the flowers and herbs, the nuns could, for a moment, become just women again, feel the sun on their skin, the scent of the leaves, the gentle breeze, and perhaps, in that green and secret space, rediscover a fragment of what they had left outside the walls, running away. A forbidden word, almost unthinkable within the convent walls. But every now and then, it happened. A nun would simply disappear, and when that happened, the effect was immediate, like a cold wave that ran down every stone corridor. It all began subtly, a harsh murmur among the older nuns, a nervous glance from the Mother Superior during morning prayers, then the official announcement, dry, direct. Sister so-and-so had left the community without permission. The words were carefully chosen, as if the very mention of the escape might infect the others with dangerous ideas. But of course, the news spread like wildfire. Everyone tried to figure out the detail. When had she left? How had she gotten past the guards and the ever-watchful gates? Had she received help? And most disturbing, where was she now? It was a mystery that simmered beneath the surface of the official silence. The psychological effect was powerful. If one had managed to escape, that meant that, in theory, it was possible. And this simple idea was more feared by the authorities than the escape itself. Soon, the rules became even stricter. The schedules were more controlled. Surveillance was redoubled, because fear was an excellent method of prevention. And few things frightened the nuns more than the prospect of collective punishment. The atmosphere among the sisters was tense. Some, sincerely shaken, prayed for the fugitive's soul. Others secretly harbored a spark of admiration and, who knows, even envy. Because running away was not just an act of courage, it was a total denial of the system that had shaped every aspect of their lives. And of course, there were those who wondered all the time, why had she run away? Was it the burden of monastic life? Was it a forbidden love from the past that called her back? A simple desire for freedom? There were no answers, and the absence of answers was, in itself, fuel for the collective imagination. In the days that followed, the smiles faded. Conversations, already scarce, became even more cautious. Each nun walked as if she were being watched, because she was. It was a brutal reminder that no matter how much forgiveness and mercy were preached, control was the most palpable force within those walls. And that, in the end, the greatest sin was not breaking a vow. It was wanting to be free. If there was something that could unite genuine faith and medieval superstition in an almost inseparable dance, it was relics, sacred objects that, for many nuns, represented direct bridges to the divine. And, let's face it, they also had a certain mysticism that would make any witch of the time smile. The ritual of touching the relics was shrouded in an almost theatrical respect. When it was announced that a particular relic would be displayed, a fragment of a saint's bone, a piece of cloth supposedly touched by heavenly hands, the atmosphere took on an air of solemnity as thick as incense. The nuns would approach in a line, eyes lowered, breath held, and deep down, each one carried her own secret expectation. The touch was brief, controlled, but intensely symbolic. The cold of the metal, glass, or wooden reliquary passed to the fingers as a tangible reminder of the presence of the sacred, or at least of what was believed to be sacred. It didn't matter much if the authenticity of the relic was questionable. There, in that moment, what mattered was the faith that was placed in the gesture. Of course, alongside this sincere devotion, less official stories circulated around the convent. They said that certain relics cured illnesses. Others warded off nightmares. There were those who swore they had seen changes in their fortunes after touching them for a longer period of time. And since no one wanted to be left behind in terms of spiritual protection, it was not uncommon for discreet attempts to touch the object for a second longer than allowed. The most curious thing was the contrast. In an environment that preached reason and spiritual self-control, seeing nuns who normally exuded composure become, for a moment, almost children fascinated by an amulet was a sight in itself. A reminder that, regardless of their vows, they all carried in their chests a human heart with its oldest hopes and fears. And there were also the more skeptical nuns, of course, those who, with a disguised smile, participated in the ritual without expecting great miracle. But even they did not dare to disrespect the ceremony, because, superstition or not, in that world surrounded by uncertainty, it was always good to guarantee a little extra protection, just in case. Thus, the cold touch of the relics continued to play its role, not only as a gesture of faith, but as a ritual that mixed belief, tradition, and that very human trait of seeking security in symbols. Because, after all, even in a medieval convent, no one was completely immune to the desire for a small miracle. At the end of this journey, you may be wondering how it was possible to sleep in a medieval convent. And the answer, let's be honest, is simple. People slept little. They slept badly, and almost always, they slept with guilt. Between fasts that emptied the stomach, penance that weighed on the spirit, bells that tore through the dawn, and habits that suffocated even the last breath of comfort, the nun's sleep was more an exercise in disciplinary rest. The bed, a simple wooden bed, covered by a thin mattress and a blanket that, on cold days, seemed more symbolic than function. Now, think about your own bedroom. Maybe you're lying on a soft mattress, with clean sheets and a pillow that seems to hug you with every breath you take. The white noise of a soft fan plays in the background. A warm lamp is on the side. And get this, no one is going to wake you with an insistent bell at 3 in the morning to sing penitential chants. You can choose the temperature of the room, adjust your position as many times as you like, and above all, sleep with the peace of mind that you won't have to embroider until you bleed at dawn. There are no veils to hide who you are, no vows of silence to keep you away from those you love. And let's be honest, even the simplest of your pillows would be treated as a treasure worthy of a relic in any medieval convent. There is a subtle lesson here. In a world that so often presses us down, that envelops us in heavy routines and rigid expectation, we still have a freedom that these women never dreamed of having. The freedom to close our eyes without fear, to dream without guilt, to wake up without the weight of imposed vows. So as you settle down to sleep to the sounds of this story, remember, your modern comfort is no trivial luxury. It is an achievement to be grateful for. May your sleep today be deep, serene, And above all, free. Free in the way those nuns, even in their most intimate moments, perhaps never could be. Now, dim the lights even further. Let the tiredness gently embrace your body, and allow your mind to float gently, carried by distant echoes of this